Welcome to the Art of Us podcast, where we bridge the gender divide series. Today, we're doing a deep dive based on material from Xavier Ezra Borrero.
That's right, a book that's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elevatepublishingco.com.
The Art of Us, Bridging the Gender Divide. It's about understanding, communication, bridging gaps.
Absolutely. And if you're finding this discussion interesting, you really should check out the full book by Xavier Ezra Borrero. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and the elevatepublishingco.com website.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elevatepublishingco.com.
So today we're tackling a really challenging, often avoided question. What's porn got to do with it? Our source material for this one is based on insights from Xavier Ezra Borrero's book, and we're really drawing from the chapter that's actually called What's Porn Got to Do with It? So our mission today is to unpack what this material reveals about the complex impacts of porn on connection, on expectations, maybe even on society as a whole. And, right off the bat, the material uses this fantastic analogy that really sets the stage. It suggests that trying to learn about sex from watching porn, it's like learning how to drive by watching, say, the Fast and the Furious movies.
Oh, that's a great image. It hits you immediately, doesn't it? It highlights that total disconnect from, reality. You get the spectacle, right? The impossible stunts, the slick editing, the professional performers making everything look easy, almost consequence-free.
It's exactly. No traffic laws, no three-point turns, definitely no parallel parking.
Yeah.
But if that's your driving school, you end up trying to navigate real intimacy, which is nuanced, vulnerable, sometimes messy with expectations that are just completely out of whack. You basically have zero real-world skills. Maybe you're even heading into dangerous territory without realizing it.
And that's exactly why this whole topic, the one people tend to dodge, has such significant implications. Like, the material points out, it hits individuals and relationships pretty hard. The aim here seems to be to shed light on those things that quietly kill connection.
Okay, so let's dive into the first big area this material tackles. It frames it as the illusion of education. And it makes a really strong case that the expectations porn sets aren't just unrealistic, the material calls them dangerous.
Right, and it breaks down why they're dangerous. For instance, there's often zero real talk about consent. It's just assumed, maybe acted out performatively. And consequences. Physical, emotional, not really part of the picture. The focus is all performance, visual stimulation, not actual connection. The source uses this phrase, just lights, camera, dopamine. Pleasure without presence.
That idea, pleasure without presence, that really sticks. And it's not just theory. The material shares this story, an anecdote that really brought it home for me. It talks about an acquaintance who ended up in the ICU seriously ill after a risky sexual encounter. The doctors were stumped until one finally asked about unprotected anal sex. And yes, that was a severe bacterial infection, nearly fatal.
And the material is careful here. It's not saying porn caused the infection, obviously. Bacteria did that. But the argument is that the fantasy world, the illusion of this intense, spontaneous, consequence-free act, made him forget reality. Basic biology, really. Risk, infection. The language it uses is pretty vivid. Porn handed him the gun, loaded it with illusion, and made it look fun. It fostered a mindset where real-world risks felt smaller.
Wow. That really underscores how potent these illusions can be, especially when they float free of any real consequences.
Exactly. It's a simulation, but it doesn't equip you for the actual mechanics, the actual risks of real life.
Which leads us right into the next point. The material explores the brain science bit. It calls it dopamine and disconnect.
Yeah, this part gets into the how. How does the desensitization happen? It talks about dopamine release. You engage with the super stimulating, always new content, and boom, dopamine. It's your brain's reward signal. But the material points out, with this kind of constant high-level stimulation, the more you consume, the more you need. Your brain literally adapts. It starts needing more and more intense, novel stuff just to get the same feeling. And that leads straight to desensitization. What used to feel exciting just goes numb.
So, okay, if your brain gets wired to expect that level of hyper-stimulation from a screen, what happens with a real person?
Well, that's the disconnect, isn't it? Real intimacy, which is about vulnerability, emotional give and take, focusing on another actual human being. It can start to feel, boring. That's the word the source uses. Your brain's been trained to chase the screen-based dopamine hit, not the quieter, more complex rewards of genuine connection, flaws and all.
And the material doesn't shy away from listing some pretty tough potential consequences here, especially for men. Things like erectile dysfunction, anxiety, even depression.
Right, and it stresses this isn't just physical. The argument is deeper. It affects your mind, your spirit, your basic ability to actually show up or don't show up in your real relationships. It impacts desire, presence, authenticity.
Okay, let's shift gears a little because the material goes into something bigger and frankly, pretty dark. The industry no one wants to talk about.
This is a really critical point. The source emphasizes that this isn't just individual choices or brain chemistry we're talking about. It's connected to a massive global business, a global multi-billion-dollar industry, as it puts it.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. The material states very directly that a significant chunk of it is directly tied to sex trafficking. It's blunt. Women and children, exploited, recorded, shared, often presented simply as entertainment.
Now, I think the immediate reaction for a lot of people hearing that is, whoa, okay, but that's not what I watch. I would never. But the material pushes back on that. It makes the point that once it's online, it's almost impossible to trace the origin. You just don't know for sure if the content, even stuff that seems okay, isn't linked to exploitation somewhere down the line. It also brings up the horror of non-consensual material revenge porn, for instance. People having their private lives weaponized, shared without consent. The trauma is immense. The source even mentions victims who have tragically taken their own lives because of that exposure and violation.
And the conclusion the material draws from this is really stark. It basically challenges you, the consumer. It says, and this quote really stays with you, "Every click supports an economy of exploitation. It doesn't matter if you meant to, the demand fuels the machine." The argument is that just by participating, just consuming, you're part of a system, regardless of your intent, that has these deeply disturbing elements woven into it.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Just a reminder, this deep dive is based on really powerful and insightful material from Xavier Ezra Borrero's book, looking at the theme, What's Porn Got to Do with It? We've been focusing on key points from Chapter 10, which has the same title, What's Porn Got to Do with It? If these ideas are sparking questions for you or maybe making you think differently, checking out Chapter 10 of the source material itself could offer even more context on these complex issues.
Okay, so moving towards the end, the material ties these different strands, the illusion, the dopamine, the industry, together with a final major point. It calls it killing synergy. Well, the material argues that consuming this kind of content essentially teaches you to consume without giving, to take without reciprocating. It trains your brain, your responses, to prioritize the screen's instant feedback over the active work of real connection. It pulls your focus, your presence, away from a partner. Your body learns to respond to a device, not a person.
And the source draws a sharp contrast between that and what real intimacy, real synergy actually needs. It points out that genuine connection requires things like vulnerability, communication, feedback, all the stuff that's missing when you're just passively consuming digital content alone.
Exactly. So the view presented is that this offers instant gratification with zero investment. It's framed as fantasy without responsibility. It's basically the opposite of the mutual exchange, the shared presence, the give and take that allows real intimacy to grow and become something more.
So it sounds like the argument is this isn't just some harmless individual activity. It fundamentally undermines the very things needed for healthy, connected relationships.
That's precisely the argument. It trains habits and expectations that just don't align with what real deep connection requires: presence, vulnerability, reciprocity.
Right. Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. Let's try and summarize what this material ultimately suggests is the answer to that big question. What's porn got to do with it? Well, based on exploring this source, the answer seems to be pretty much everything. It argues that it warps expectations with dangerous illusions. It can sabotage intimacy by rewiring our reward systems towards disconnect. It fuels a massive industry with a dark underbelly of exploitation. And fundamentally, it trains the brain for pleasure without presence, consumption without reciprocity, effectively killing synergy.
And there's that other crucial layer the material points out, maybe the most insidious part. That constant exposure, the normalization of it all, it desensitizes us to the real damage. Real people, real trauma, real lives torn apart. We just become less sensitive to the human cost involved.
But the material doesn't just leave us with the problem. It issues a kind of challenge, doesn't it, to you, the listener. It says basically, don't just shake your head at the headlines about trafficking or whatever. It calls for action, for engagement. Things like actually educating our sons, talking openly with our daughters, maybe holding friends accountable sometimes, and definitely being willing to have these difficult conversations ourselves.
Yeah, because the material is really clear on this. The only thing more dangerous than the content itself is the quiet. Silence just lets all these issues, the exploitation, the desensitization, the disconnect, continue unchallenged.
And so if you're still wondering, after all this, what porn's got to do with it? According to this material, the answer is simple. everything. It definitely challenges us to think hard about how we cultivate connection and real understanding in our own lives, in our relationships. In a world that often feels pretty divided, maybe just being willing to face uncomfortable truths and lead by example in talking about them, maybe that's one way we build a stronger, more genuinely connected world. If this deep dive into the material from Xavier Ezra Borrero's book, particularly our look at Chapter 10, What's Porn Got to Do with It, resonated with you or sparked more questions, we really encourage you to seek out Chapter 10 of the source material directly. There's a lot more depth there to explore these really important insights. A massive thank you, obviously, to Xavier Ezra Borrero for these incredible insights presented in The Art of Us, Bridging the Gender Divide. And again, you can find his book, explore all of this much more deeply. It's by Xavier Ezra Borrero, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Go pick up The Art of Us, Bridging the Gender Divide, and continue this exploration for yourself. In a world that often feels divided, let's keep building a community grounded in unity and understanding, and try to lead by example. And a thank you all for listening to The Art of Us, Bridging the Gender Divide. Until next time.